longer than there have been fishes in the ocean.
What if the man who wrote one of the most beloved Christmas songs in American history died on a December afternoon in Maine and most of America didn't even notice? He sold over 15 million records and the music industry quietly buried him alive in the 1980s. He wrote a 6.5-minute song with no chorus and turned it into a top 10 hit. He met an old girlfriend in a convenience store and accidentally created a piece of music that plays on every soft rock radio station every December for 40 years and counting. Then prostate cancer caught him 3 years before it finished the job. This is the rise and fall of Dan Fogelberg, Peoria, Illinois. August 13, 1951. If you wanted to plot the geographic center of mid-century America on a map, you could do worse than start here. Charles Kuralt once described Peoria as a town in the middle of the state, in the middle of the country, in the middle of the world. And on a humid summer afternoon in that exact middle, Margaret Fogelberg, a classically trained pianist and Scottish immigrant, gave birth to her third son, Daniel Grayling Fogelberg. His father was Lawrence Peter Fogelberg, a Swedish-American band director with the kind of credentials that mattered in a town like Peoria. He led the bands at Woodruff High School. He led the bands at Pekin Community High School. He directed the Bradley University Band at football and basketball games. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II, playing in a military orchestra. The man's entire life had been music, music, and more music, and he had married a woman who could play Chopin from memory. If you're loving these songs, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from and which song still gives you chills?
Old man, look at my life, I'm a lot like you.
This was not a household where music was a hobby. Music was the air the family breathed. When Dan was 4 years old, his father did something that would echo through the rest of his life. During a Bradley University rehearsal, Lawrence handed his youngest son a baton and let him stand in front of the band and conduct. The boy stood there with the orchestra spread out behind him, his father directing the actual performance from the back, and felt something that he later said was both magical and powerful. Most kids that age are eating paste. Dan Fogelberg was conducting a university band. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The instruments came one by one: a Hawaiian slide guitar from his grandfather, a Mel Bay instructional book, a piano, then a regular guitar. By age 14, he was playing in his first real band, a Beatles cover outfit called The Clan, all 4 members wearing matching black velour pullovers because that's what 14-year-olds in 1965 thought a band should look like. His second band, The Coachmen, released a single in 1967 with both songs written by a 16-year-old Dan Fogelberg. He had also negotiated a wardrobe upgrade. The Coachmen had been wearing Paul Revere and the Raiders outfits when Dan joined, and his condition for joining was that those costumes had to go immediately. He was not yet old enough to vote, and he was already telling other musicians how to dress. By the time he graduated from Woodruff High School in 1969, the kid had developed 2 things that would define his entire career. The first was a voice, a clean, soaring tenor with the kind of natural 3-part harmony instinct you cannot teach. The second was a quiet, stubborn certainty that whatever else he was going to do with his life, it was going to involve writing songs. He enrolled at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. First he majored in theater, then he switched to painting. Neither one stuck. What stuck was a coffee house called the Red Herring, where Fogelberg started performing solo acoustic sets, just him and a guitar and a stack of original songs. In 1971, he made his first solo recordings there at a folk festival. That same coffeehouse circuit produced a kid named Irving Azoff, a fast-talking, sharp-elbowed concert promoter who had been managing a local rock band called Rio Speedwagon. Azoff caught a Fogelberg set, listened to those original songs, and made a decision that would shape both their lives. He told Dan to drop out of college and let him handle the rest. Lawrence Fogelberg, the band director who had spent his entire adult life inside academic institutions, did not throw a fit. He told his son to give it 1 year and see what happened. That moment, that quiet permission from a man who had every reason to insist on a college degree, would surface a decade later in a song called Leader of the Band, in the line about the freedom that came when it was time to go. Dan dropped out. He drove to Los Angeles. The bet had been placed. The early 70s in American music were a strange and crowded country. The Eagles were forming. James Taylor was selling millions of records writing about quiet rooms and sad weather.
I'm a lot like you were.
Jackson Browne was turning his diary into platinum albums, and every record label in Los Angeles was trying to find the next sensitive young man with an acoustic guitar. Irving Azoff sent Fogelberg to Nashville to develop. He worked as a session musician. He absorbed everything. In 1972, with producer Norbert Putnam, he recorded his debut album Home Free on Columbia Records. The lukewarm response was almost a tradition for soft rock debuts in that era. The album did not crack the top of any chart. It quietly drifted onto a few hundred radio playlists and quietly drifted off again. There was, however, one strange exception. A radio station in Jackson, Mississippi called WZZDQ decided that Home Free was the greatest album they had ever heard, and they played it constantly. Local promoters in Jackson booked Fogelberg into the City Auditorium, a venue with 2,500 seats. The show sold out in 10 days. When they called Fogelberg's agent to share the news, the agent thought there had been a mistake. Fogelberg had been playing clubs with under 100 people in attendance, and now suddenly there was a sold-out auditorium in Mississippi waiting for him to show up.
It was hot, so we jumped in. We were summer.
Home Free would eventually go platinum, but it would take years. In the meantime, Fogelberg toured as the opening act for Van Morrison and made very little money and slept in cheap motels and kept writing songs. The breakthrough came in 1974 with his second album, Souvenirs, produced by Joe Walsh of the Eagles, who would become one of the most important friends of Fogelberg's life. The single Part of the Plan finally cracked the Billboard charts and gave the country its first real glimpse of what this kid could do. Then came Captured Angel in 1975. Fogelberg recorded most of it himself in Peoria, playing nearly every instrument. The album expanded his audience, especially among college-age women who heard something in his voice that the louder, harder rockers of the era simply did not offer. Then Netherlands in 1977, then Twin Sons of Different Mothers in 1978, his collaboration with jazz flutist Tim Weisberg, then Phoenix in 1979, which produced Longer, a song that hit number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became one of the most played wedding songs of the decade. By 1979, Dan Fogelberg was in a strange and rare position. He was not a critical darling in the way of Springsteen, and he was not a stadium-filling rock star in the way of the Eagles. He was something else, a quieter and more durable phenomenon, a singer-songwriter whose albums went platinum on the strength of word of mouth and FM radio, and the sense shared by a couple of million Americans that this man was writing songs about their actual lives. That same year he played Carnegie Hall. His parents flew in from Peoria. His father, who had been to Carnegie Hall exactly once in his life, decades earlier, to watch Arturo Toscanini conduct the New York Philharmonic, sat in the audience and watched his son perform on the same stage. Dan called it one of the proudest moments of his life. The legitimate musician had finally proved to the legitimate musician that he too was a legitimate musician. The hardest thing in any career is what comes after a peak.
T-shirt dripping, dripping wet. How can I forget?
The fall is rarely the cliff. The fall is usually the long, slow grade. December 24, 1975, Peoria, Illinois. Dan Fogelberg was home for Christmas, visiting his parents in the house he grew up in. His mother needed whipping cream to make Irish coffees, the kind of small, ordinary errand that nobody remembers a week later, let alone 48 years later. The only store open on Christmas Eve was a small convenience store at the top of Abington Hill on Fry Avenue. Dan walked in, headed for the dairy case, and stood behind a woman in the frozen foods aisle. He touched her on the sleeve. She turned around. Her purse hit the floor. Her name was Jill Anderson. She had been his high school girlfriend at Woodruff High, class of 1969. They had dated through the back end of high school and intermittently through college. He had gone to Illinois. She had gone to Western Illinois. She had moved to Chicago, become a teacher, and married a physical education teacher whose marriage was not going well. He had moved to Colorado and become Dan Fogelberg. There was no bar open in Peoria on Christmas Eve, so they did what two former teenagers in a small Illinois town would do. They bought a six-pack of Olympia beer at a liquor store, sat in her car, and drank it slowly while the snow fell outside. They talked for 2 hours. They reminisced. They laughed. They cried a little. They acknowledged in the careful, half-spoken way that people in their 20s acknowledge such things, that her marriage was a compromise. The beer ran out. Their tongues got tired. She kissed him goodbye, and she drove away, and as he walked back to his parents' house, the snow turned into rain. He did not write the song right away. He sat with the memory for several years. He wrote a few drafts and threw them away. And then, around 1980, working on what would become his masterpiece, a double album called The Innocent Age.
Like a coin that won't get tossed, rolling home to you.
He finally got it down. Same Old Lang Syne is 6 minutes and 20 seconds long. It has no chorus. It is essentially one extremely detailed verse that keeps going until the story is over. By every conventional rule of pop radio in 1980, the song should not have worked. Programmers wanted 3.5-minute hits with hooks you could sing in the shower. Same Old Lang Syne was practically a short film. It hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. It debuted on the chart on December 27th, the perfect window between Christmas and New Year's, and lodged itself permanently in the seasonal rotation of every adult contemporary radio station in North America. To this day, every December, the moment the temperature drops below 40 degrees, you hear that opening piano figure in a grocery store, and somewhere in the country, a middle-aged person stops their cart and stares at the frozen foods for a moment longer than they meant to. Enjoying this musical video? Subscribe and turn on the bell. It's the only way to catch our next deep dive into the music you grew up with. Jill Anderson, by the way, would not publicly identify herself as the woman in the song for 32 years. She heard it for the first time on the radio on her drive to work, recognized the entire scene, and kept her mouth shut to protect Dan. She would later note dryly that he took too artistic liberties with the truth. Her eyes are green, not blue, and her husband was a PE teacher, not an architect. The architect, she said, just sounded better in the song. The Innocent Age, released in October 1981, was Fogelberg's commercial and critical peak, a double album in an era when the public did not generally embrace double albums. It produced 4 top 20 singles. Same Old Lang Syne, Hard to Say, Run for the Roses, written for the Kentucky Derby and adopted by the Derby as a kind of unofficial anthem, and the song that mattered most to him personally, Leader of the Band. Leader of the Band was a love letter to his father. Fogelberg later said that if he could have written only one song in his entire life, it would have been that one. He wrote it not as a single, not as a commercial proposition. He wrote it because his father, the legitimate musician, had quietly given him an entire life of music and never once asked for credit. He played it for Lawrence in person before releasing it. The old man broke down. He had spent 40 years directing high school bands in the middle of Illinois, and now his youngest son had distilled his life into 4.5 minutes of acoustic guitar and adult contemporary radio gold.
I stood behind her in the frozen foods.
Lawrence Fogelberg died in August 1982, less than a year after the song was released. He had given dozens of interviews about it in the months between. He got to watch it climb the charts. He got to see his name on the lips of strangers who had never met him. The song hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the Adult Contemporary chart. By the time he died, there was nothing left unsaid between father and son. Dan Fogelberg later said that fact was probably the most important thing the song ever accomplished, and the chart positions were a distant second. If the story ended here, it would be a clean American success arc. A Peoria kid makes it to Carnegie Hall. A son writes the perfect song for his father in time for the father to hear it. A platinum album makes everybody happy. But this is a rise and fall, and the fall, as it usually does, came from a direction nobody saw. The 1980s did not love Dan Fogelberg. The 1980s loved synthesizers, big drums, MTV-friendly haircuts, and choreographed videos. The aesthetic that had made Fogelberg a household name in the 1970s, that warm acoustic California folk rock sound with stacked harmonies and 10-minute closing tracks, had aged out of the radio formats almost overnight. He released Windows and Walls in 1984. The singles, The Language of Love and Believe in Me, charted respectably but did not approach the heights of The Innocent Age. The cultural ground was shifting under him. In 1985, in a move that fully demonstrated either his stubbornness or his integrity depending on your point of view, he released High Country Snows, a bluegrass album. In 1985, while Madonna and Prince and Michael Jackson were dominating the charts, Dan Fogelberg drove down to Nashville with Vince Gill, Ricky Skaggs, Doc Watson, Jerry Douglas, David Grisman, Chris Hillman, and Herb Pedersen, and recorded an album of acoustic mountain music. He described the record himself as life in the off-ramp, a quiet rebellion against what he called life in the fast lane. It is now considered one of the best-selling bluegrass albums of all time. In 1985, however, the people in suits at the record company stared at him like he had brought a horse-drawn carriage to a Formula One race.
It's hard for me to say I'm sorry.
He came back to rock with Exiles in 1987, then The Wild Places in 1990, an album steeped in environmental themes that reflected his life in the Colorado mountains, where he had built a home in the San Juans near Pagosa Springs at 9,000 feet of elevation. Then River of Souls in 1993, another record concerned with ecology and the natural world, a record that almost nobody at his label particularly wanted. The pattern that defined his last 15 years in the industry was the pattern of every aging singer-songwriter from his era. The albums were good, the audience that had loved him was still out there, but the radio formats had moved on. MTV had no interest in a 40-year-old man playing acoustic guitar about glaciers. The arenas got smaller, the press attention got thinner. He was becoming, slowly and without drama, the music industry's least favorite category. Yesterday's hitmaker, he responded the way a lot of artists in his position responded. He stopped chasing it. He spent more time at his home in Maine, on Deer Isle, overlooking Egamogan Reach. He sailed, he skied, he spent time with his third wife, a musician named Jean Marie Mayer, whom he married in 2002. He recorded a Christmas album the first Christmas morning in 1999. In 2003, he released Full Circle, a return to the soft rock folk sound that had made him in the first place. It was his first album of new material in a decade. It came and went without much fanfare. Most of America had quietly forgotten him. The country was wrong about that, but the country did not yet know it was wrong. May 2004, Dan Fogelberg was 52 years old. He was preparing for a 16-city solo acoustic tour of the East Coast and Florida. The tour was modest by the standards of his peak, but he was looking forward to it. He went in for a routine medical checkup, the kind you do before going on the road for a couple of months. The diagnosis was advanced prostate cancer. Within months, the cancer had spread to his bones. The tour was canceled. The treatment was experimental and brutal. He underwent therapy at Harvard Medical School. He went into partial remission, a small grace but never full remission. From that point on, the rest of his life was about the cancer and about the music he could still get into a tape recorder before the cancer finished what it had started. He recorded a song for his wife Jean called Sometimes a Song. He sent it to her on Valentine's Day with a dozen roses.
24 and there's so much more.
He did not initially intend to release it. He used what little public platform he still had to issue an extraordinary plea, asking every man over 50 and every man over 40 with a family history to get checked, to get the blood test, to endure the indignity of the physical exam. He wrote that he did not want anyone else going through what he was going through. The man who had built his career on songs of intimate confession was now using that voice to try to save lives, and he did it without self-pity, without drama, just plain practical advice from a dying man who knew what he was doing. He kept recording. With the help of an engineer named James Tuttle, he laid down songs that he asked his wife to release after he was gone. 11 of them. He gave Jean specific instructions. These were her songs to release, in her time, on her terms. The cancer kept moving. December 16, 2007, Dan Fogelberg died at his home on Deer Isle, in Maine, with Jean at his side. He was 56 years old. He had been fighting for 3.5 years. The death made news, but not the kind of news the death of a 15 million record-selling singer-songwriter probably should have made. He had been out of the cultural conversation for so long that a generation of younger listeners barely knew who he was. The obituaries were respectful and accurate and short. Within a week, the news cycle had moved on. A few days after he died, a woman in St. Louis named Jill Grulich, who had once been Jill Anderson of Peoria, Illinois, picked up a phone and called the Peoria Journal-Star. For 32 years, she had kept the secret of same Old Lang Syne. She was the woman in the frozen foods aisle. She was the eyes that flew open wide. She was the lover who would have liked to say she loved the man, but didn't like to lie. She came forward, she said, because she felt that with Dan gone, the story belonged to the people who loved his music. She gave one quiet interview and went back to teaching second grade. She has spoken sparingly about him in the years since. She has said only that she will always have a place in her heart for him, that he would have been a special person to her even without the song.
24 and there's so much more.
That is, as it happens, exactly the kind of ending Dan Fogelberg would have written. The legacy work began almost immediately. Jean Fogelberg, his widow, became one of the great archivists in modern music. In 2009, she released Love in Time, the 11 previously unpublished songs Dan had recorded in his final years. The album charted on the Billboard 200, the first Fogelberg record to chart since 1993. In 2017, 10 years after his death, she released Live at Carnegie Hall, sourced from a 1979 tape made by his touring sound company on the night his father had sat in the audience. It charted at number 71. It was the first of his live albums to ever crack the Billboard 200. The same year, she released a tribute to Dan Fogelberg.
I give all I can.
A CD compiled with the help of his lifelong friend Joe Walsh and his manager Irving Azoff, featuring performances by Garth Brooks, Trisha Yearwood, Vince Gill, Amy Grant, Jimmy Buffett, Michael McDonald, Donna Summer, Boz Scaggs, the Zac Brown Band, and a half-dozen other major country and pop artists. Garth Brooks, in interviews, has stated plainly that Dan Fogelberg shaped his musical worldview. He has described going through college with Fogelberg's lyrics next to his bed, reading them like passages from a book. Jim James, the frontman of My Morning Jacket, has cited Fogelberg as a foundational influence and bought Fogelberg's old recording console for his own home studio. The list of artists quietly carrying Dan Fogelberg's musical DNA is long, and it includes some of the biggest names in country and indie rock. In Peoria, the city renamed Abington Street, the street that runs alongside Woodruff High School and continues up to the convenience store on top of Abington Hill as Fogelberg Parkway. The convenience store where he met Jill Anderson is still there, now called Short Stop Food Mart. Every December, Fogelberg fans make the pilgrimage. They stand in the parking lot, they look at the dairy case, some of them cry a little. A memorial garden was built in Riverfront Park in 2010. In 2017, Fogelberg was inducted into the Colorado Music Hall of Fame on what would have been his 66th birthday. This is the strange shape of his afterlife.
And I touched her on the sleeve.
The man who was largely forgotten in his last decade has been steadily and patiently restored, song by song and tribute by tribute, by a widow who refused to let him fade, and a network of musicians who never forgot what they had taken from him. Dan Fogelberg sold over 15 million records. He wrote a song about his father that turned out to be one of the most beloved songs of the 1980s. He wrote a song about an old girlfriend in a parking lot that became part of the American Christmas canon. He sang at Carnegie Hall while his father watched from the audience. He went to Pagosa Springs and built a house on a mountain. He died at 56 on a beautiful island in Maine, before his time, with the woman he loved beside him. He was never the loudest voice. He was never the trendiest face. He never had a tabloid scandal or a drug bust or a public meltdown. He just wrote songs, the kind of songs that quietly attach themselves to your life and refuse to leave. The kind of songs that show up in a grocery store in late December when you are buying eggnog and suddenly you are thinking about somebody you have not thought about in 20 years. The kind of songs your father might have liked if you had ever thought to play one for him. The leader of the band is tired and his eyes are growing old, but his blood runs through my instrument and his song is in my soul. 45 years after Dan Fogelberg wrote that line about his father, somebody, somewhere, plays it for their own father every June on Father's Day. The song does its quiet work. It always has. What's your Dan Fogelberg memory? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of rock's greatest stories. Thanks for rewinding with us. If this hit the right note, check out the videos on screen now, and subscribe so you never miss another song from the golden age of music.
Let her eyes through open walls.